Okay, so imagine this. You're a guy in the 2nd century. You personally knew the Apostle John. Like, you sat with him, ate with him, heard him teach with your own ears. And one of the things John kept hammering on, the thing he kept coming back to, was that Jesus was coming back soon, before the worst of it, before the great judgment falls on the earth. Now, fast forward almost 2,000 years, and somebody tells you, no, that whole idea, that's brand new. Some guy named Darby made it up in 1830. You'd be like, wait, what? That's the tension at the center of everything Ken Johnson has spent decades trying to unravel. And honestly, whether you agree with him or not, this rabbit hole goes way deeper than most people realize.
Before we get into it, let me be upfront with you guys. Some of you who've been around a while know I had another channel. That channel got pulled from the monetization program. Demonetized. Gone. And this channel got hit too, which means the work I put into these videos doesn't come back through the usual way. If this kind of content blesses you, if you find yourself learning something, going down rabbit holes at 2 a.m. because of something I said, please consider contributing over on Ko-Fi. The link is in the description. Even a small amount keeps this going. Now, if you love Ken Johnson, this is genuinely the place. This channel is dedicated to looking at his work in depth. The books we're covering today are linked in the description. I strongly recommend getting them if you want a first-hand look at what Ken is actually saying, because Ken has done primary research on ancient manuscripts that most of us will never sit down and read ourselves. Also, Ken has his own YouTube channel and it's linked below. Go follow him directly. Subscribe to him. He explains his own work better than anyone. One more thing before we dive in. I want to be crystal clear. I am not trying to discredit Ken's work. Not at all. I'm exploring it, I'm presenting it, I'm finding it fascinating, but I'm not a theologist. I'm not a Greek or Syriac scholar, and some of what I present today is going to be my interpretation of what Ken says. If I get something wrong, that is completely on me, not on Ken. This is a channel about engaging with ideas, not a substitute for reading the source material yourself. All right, now let's get into this. Ken Johnson holds a doctorate in theology from Christian College of Texas. He runs BibleFacts.org. And at his core, he is a man obsessed with one question. What did the first Christians actually believe? Not what the church decided 300 years later. Not what your denomination's founders decided in the 1500s. Not what John Nelson Darby figured out in 1830. What did the actual students of the actual apostles teach? That's the question he keeps asking. And the answer, he argues, changes everything about how we understand end times theology. Here's the thing about church history that most Sunday school classes skip entirely. After the 12 apostles died, they left behind students. Real people. People who had personally sat at their feet. People like Polycarp of Smyrna, who was a direct student of the Apostle John, the same John who wrote Revelation. Polycarp didn't just read John's letters, he knew John personally. Ignatius of Antioch, reportedly a student of both Peter and Paul, and possibly John as well. He was martyred around 107 AD. Before he died, he wrote 7 letters to early churches that survive to this day. Irenaeus of Lyon, who was taught by Polycarp. So the chain goes John, Polycarp, Irenaeus. That's just 2 steps from an actual apostle and one of the most important theological minds of the 2nd century. Ken's argument is simple but powerful. If you want to know what the apostles taught, look at what their direct students wrote. Because those guys didn't have denominations to protect. They didn't have centuries of tradition layered on top. They were still basically in shouting distance of the source. And according to Ken Johnson, what these men wrote about the end times looks nothing like what most modern churches teach, but it looks a lot like what pre-tribulation rapture believers claim. Now that's a bold claim, and Ken doubles down on it with primary source documents, some of which are obscure enough that most pastors have never even heard of them. Let's talk about 2 books Ken wrote that form the backbone of this whole topic. The first is Ancient Church Fathers, What the Disciples of the Apostles Taught.
This is essentially Ken's attempt to compile and explain the writings of the 2nd century Church Fathers, the men one generation removed from the 12 apostles. He goes through their writings on doctrine, on the Trinity, on communion, on the law of Moses, and yes, on the end times. The second is the rapture, the pre-tribulational rapture viewed from the Bible and the ancient church. This one is more focused. Ken takes the specific question of when the rapture happens, before, during, or after the tribulation, and argues that the ancient church documents, properly read, support the pre-tribulational position. Now here's what Ken's methodology looks like in practice. He doesn't just quote one line from an ancient writer. He maps out chains of theological transmission. He's essentially saying, look, if Polycarp believed something, and Irenaeus, who learned from Polycarp, believed the same thing, and then the people Irenaeus taught believed it, you've got consistent theological DNA going back to the Apostle John himself. That's not a tradition. That's the original teaching. One of the central documents Ken keeps coming back to is the Epistle of Barnabas. Not the biblical Barnabas necessarily, the authorship is debated, but this document dates to somewhere around 70 to 130 AD, making it almost contemporaneous with the New Testament letters. And Ken's read of it is that it shows the early church was constantly expecting prophetic fulfillment. They weren't waiting around passively. They were tracking signs. They were connecting Old Testament prophecies to what was happening around them in real time. Ken also points to the Didache, which translates to the teaching, a document that may be the oldest non-canonical Christian text in existence, possibly dating to the late 1st century. It's essentially a church manual. It covers baptism, fasting, communion, how to receive traveling prophets. And Ken argues it reflects a community that was pre-millennial, meaning they believed Jesus would literally return and reign on earth, and that they were watching for specific signs before that return. Here's where it gets really interesting though, and this is the open loop I want to park here for a minute. There is one specific church father who keeps showing up in these debates, and the question of what he actually taught versus what people claim he taught might be the single most contested point in all of early church eschatology. We're going to get there, but first, let me give you the framework Ken uses to make his whole argument, because without it, the individual puzzle pieces don't quite click. Ken Johnson built his case on a few key concepts that he says the early church fathers all shared. Concept 1. Imminence. The idea that Jesus could return at any moment. No required precondition. No, well, first we need X, Y, and Z to happen. The early church fathers, according to Ken, believed in what theologians call imminency, the sense that today could be the day. Paul wrote about it. Clement of Rome wrote about it. Ignatius wrote about it. And when you believe Jesus could come back literally any day, that naturally aligns with a pre-tribulational position, because if the church had to go through the tribulation first, then you'd know Jesus couldn't come back until those specific events were complete. Concept 2. The distinction between persecution and wrath. This one is subtle, and it's where a lot of the debate happens. The early church was being persecuted. Christians were being killed for their faith in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd centuries. So when early church writers say the church will go through great suffering, Ken says we have to be careful. They might be talking about that historical persecution. They are not necessarily talking about the 7-year tribulation period, which in this framework is specifically the wrath of God poured out on an unbelieving world. Ken's read of the ancient documents is that the church fathers consistently distinguished between two things: Antichrist persecution of the church, which many of them thought they were already experiencing, and God's judgment on the world, which they said the church would be spared from. This distinction, he argues, is the fingerprint of pre-tribulational thinking, even if the fathers didn't use that exact term. Concept 3. The chain of custody. This is the one that ties it all together. Ken is essentially making a legal-style argument. He's saying the burden of proof should be on the people who claim this doctrine is new. If we can trace a consistent set of beliefs from the apostles, through their students, through their students' students, and those beliefs align with pre-tribulationism, then the claim that Darby invented it in 1830 falls apart. He's not saying Darby didn't systematize it in a new way. He's saying the core conviction that the church is not appointed to God's wrath and that Christ's return is imminent is traceable all the way back. Alright, let's actually go name by name through the figures Ken highlights, because this is the heart of the book and it's what most summary videos completely skip over. Polycarp of Smyrna, 69 to 155 AD. Polycarp is the golden link in Ken's chain. He knew John personally. He was appointed bishop of Smyrna, probably by John himself. His one surviving complete letter is his epistle to the Philippians, and while it doesn't directly lay out an end times timeline, Ken reads into his language an urgent expectation of Christ's coming that aligns with imminency theology. Polycarp's martyrdom, by the way, happened around 155 AD. He was burned at the stake and then stabbed when the fire didn't kill him. He was in his 80s. His last recorded words were essentially, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king and my savior? That's the kind of man we're talking about when Ken references this tradition. Irenaeus of Lyon, c. 130 to 202 AD. Taught by Polycarp, wrote a massive work called Against Heresies. Ken cites Irenaeus as one of the clearest early voices for premillennialism, the belief that Christ will literally reign on earth for 1,000 years. Irenaeus explicitly believed in a physical future resurrection and a physical kingdom of God on earth. For Ken, this matters because premillennialism is the theological soil in which pre-tribulationism grows. If the early church was solidly premillennial, the framework is already there. Now, and I'll be honest here because this is where fair-minded people disagree, there are scholars who read Irenaeus and say he believed the church would go through the tribulation. They point to passages where Irenaeus talks about the church enduring the Antichrist. Ken's response, from what I understand of his work, is that Irenaeus is distinguishing between Antichrist's powerful persecuting power and divine wrath. It's the same distinction we talked about earlier. Hippolytus of Rome, c. 170 to 235 AD. Hippolytus wrote two critical documents, The Antichrist and On Daniel. He was obsessed with prophetic chronology. He tried to calculate the exact number of years until the end based on Daniel's visions. Ken uses Hippolytus as evidence that the early church was actively doing prophetic analysis. They weren't waiting around. They were mapping timelines. They identified which ancient empires corresponded to which beasts in Daniel. They discussed the 10-nation confederacy of the Antichrist. And according to Ken, they did all of this from within a premillennial, rapture-expecting framework. Cyprian of Carthage, c. 200 to 258 AD. Cyprian was the bishop of Carthage during an absolutely brutal period of Roman persecution. He wrote extensively about what the church should expect in the coming days. Ken focuses on passages where Cyprian writes about the church being taken out of the way, being rescued before the worst of God's judgment falls. Critics of Ken's reading say Cyprian was talking about death as an escape, not a rapture. Ken says look more carefully at the context. Cyprian distinguishes between martyrdom under Rome and something larger that's coming. Victorinus of Pedau died c. 303 AD. Almost nobody talks about Victorinus. He wrote the oldest surviving Latin commentary on Revelation. And Ken argues that Victorinus was clearly premillennial, clearly expecting a physical return of Christ, and that his reading of Revelation assumes a distinction between what happens to the church and what happens to the world during the tribulation judgments. Now, I want to be balanced here. This is one of the places where Ken has faced serious pushback from other scholars, and I'm not qualified to referee that dispute. What I can tell you is what Ken argues. that even without the pseudo-Ephraim text, there are enough other documents to support his thesis. Ephraim is not the foundation. Irenaeus and the Polycarp chain are. And here, right here, is the mini-mystery I mentioned earlier. One of these ancient writers produced a text that literally vanished from the historical record for centuries. It was rediscovered in a monastery, and it changed the conversation about what the early church believed. Which one was it? We're going to come back to that. One of the things Ken does that most rapture-focused books don't do is connect the early church fathers' end times teaching to the specific question of Israel. According to Ken, the ancient church fathers, the disciples of the apostles, were firmly pro-Israel. They believed that the return of Israel to her homeland was a necessary precursor to the end-time sequence. They weren't replacement theologians. They didn't believe the church had permanently replaced Israel in God's prophetic plan. Ken documents this across multiple church fathers and cross-references it with over 500 biblical prophecies in his book, Ancient Prophecies Revealed. His argument is that the first century church, going directly back to what the apostles taught, predicted that the Jewish people would return to their land before the end times began. And then he maps over 50 prophecies that he says were fulfilled between 1948, when Israel became a state, and 2008. Think about what this means if Ken is right. It means the early church fathers were looking for a day when a scattered, exiled, stateless people would somehow return to a land that hadn't been theirs for nearly 2 millennia. And then, in 1948, it happened. The early church fathers also, according to Ken, talked about Jerusalem returning to Jewish control, which happened in 1967. Now look, I'm not here to make a political or theological statement about Israel. That's not my lane on this channel. What I'm presenting is Ken's argument, and his argument is that you cannot understand what the church fathers taught about the rapture without understanding their expectation regarding Israel. The two are inseparable in their theology. This is also where Ken says the doctrine shifted. He traces what he calls the Schism of Nepos, a 4th century moment when the church moved from premillennialism to amillennialism. When that shift happened, the early expectation of a literal rapture, a literal tribulation, a literal Israel, and a literal millennium got slowly allegorized away. The original teaching, Ken argues, was buried. All right, the mystery text, the one that disappeared and was rediscovered. I'm talking about the works of Hippolytus. Not all of them, but specifically on the end of the world, attributed to Hippolytus. Some versions of this text vanished from Western Christian awareness for extended periods and were known only in fragments or in Eastern church traditions. Ken reproduces Hippolytus's The Antichrist and On Daniel in his book The End Times by the Ancient Church Fathers in their entirety. Most people have never read these texts. Most pastors have never read them. What do they say? Hippolytus describes the 10-nation empire of the Antichrist in detail. He identifies 3 of the 10 nations by name, drawing directly from Daniel's visions. He describes where the Antichrist will be born, a specific region. He talks about what happens to the saints during the Antichrist's reign and then what happens when God's judgment falls on the earth. Ken uses this text to argue that Hippolytus, 2 steps from the Apostle John, understood the end-time sequence in a way that supports premillennial, pre-tribulational theology. Now, here's the bigger question that Ken's work forces you to sit with. If the disciples of the apostles really did believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, a literal tribulation, a literal millennium, and the prophetic restoration of Israel, then the popular claim that all of this was invented in 1830 by John Nelson Darby doesn't hold up. And if it doesn't hold up, if this doctrine has a paper trail going back to people who personally knew the apostles, then what does that do to your theology? I'm not telling you what to conclude. Ken Johnson isn't telling you what to conclude. Or rather, he is, but he's inviting you to follow the evidence trail yourself. And the trail is long and strange and goes through monastery libraries and ancient Syriac manuscripts and documents most modern Christians have never even heard of. I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't say Ken Johnson has critics, real ones, serious ones. Scholars like Alan Kirchner have gone through Ken's citations and argued that Ken selectively reads the Church Fathers, taking passages about escaping wrath while ignoring passages in the same document where the Church is described going through Antichrist persecution. Kirchner's position is that the early church writers consistently expected Christians to face the Antichrist before Christ's return. There's also criticism around the pseudo-Ephraim text specifically, which some scholars say Ken and others use as a proof text for pre-tribulationism, when the actual manuscript says nothing of the sort. Some reviewers of Ken's books have pointed out specific factual errors, things like mislabeling Irenaeus as Protestant on a book cover, which is obviously an anachronism since Protestantism didn't exist in 130 AD. And there's a broader methodological critique, that the early church was messier and more diverse in its theology than Ken presents, that there was no single apostolic doctrine cleanly transmitted for the first 3 centuries, that you can find early church writers to support almost any theological position if you cherry-pick carefully enough. Ken is aware of these critiques. His response, as I understand it, is that the critics are confusing persecution with tribulation, and that a surface reading of the Church Fathers misses the distinctions the Fathers themselves were drawing. Who's right? I genuinely don't know. I'm not the guy to settle that debate. What I can tell you is that this is a real, ongoing, serious debate among people who have read the primary sources. It is not a debate that can be settled by one YouTube video, including this one. So what do you do with all of this? If you're someone who already believes in a pre-tribulation rapture, Ken's work gives you something you probably didn't have: historical ammunition. You can now point to Polycarp, to Irenaeus, to Hippolytus, not as people who use the same words we use today, but as people who seem to have held the same basic theological convictions about the sequence of end times events. If you're someone who's skeptical of the pre-tribulation rapture, Ken's work should at minimum give you pause. The "Darby invented it in 1830" argument is more complicated than it sounds. There was clearly something in the early church that looks like premillennial, imminency-focused, Israel-affirming theology. Whether that specifically means pre-trib rapture in the modern sense is debatable, but you can't just wave it away. And if you're someone who's never thought about any of this before, welcome to one of the most fascinating corners of church history and biblical prophecy that exists. It's a world of ancient manuscripts and forgotten bishops and documents that survived wars and fires and institutional persecution. It's the story of ideas that were buried and resurfaced centuries later. It's genuinely one of the most interesting intellectual rabbit holes I've ever fallen into. Ken has spent decades on this. He's made ancient Syriac texts and Jewish scrolls available in English that most people would never encounter otherwise. He's a man on a mission to answer one simple question in the most thorough way possible. What did the first disciples of the apostles actually believe? And the answer, if Ken is right, is something that would surprise a lot of people sitting in churches today. Guys, if you watched all the way to the end, you're my people, seriously. This stuff is not easy. It takes patience and curiosity and a willingness to sit with uncomfortable ideas. Thank you for being here. Please hit that subscribe button if you want more dives like this. Ken's books are in the description. Buy them, read them, form your own opinion. Ken's YouTube channel is also linked. Go subscribe to him directly. He puts out content that goes even deeper than what we covered today. And if this video blessed you and you want to support the work here on this channel, you can find the Ko-Fi link in the description. Even a cup of coffee worth of support makes a real difference when demonetization has hit us the way it has. Next video, we're going to go even deeper into Ken's work on the Essenes and what they knew about end times prophecy. And honestly, that one might blow your mind even more than today. See you then.